Now, our speaker today hardly needs introduction, particularly if you were here 4 weeks ago. But for the benefit of those of you who were not able to be there on that occasion, Nigel Douglas is the minister of this church and of the United Reformed Church in churches in Hotspur and in Burnham. Apart from his pastoral work, he's equally at home in the kitchen as in the pulpit. As any of you who have experienced his breakfast will know, or have partaken of his sticky buns, which he produces at the coffee morning once a month. He's widely read in philosophy and theology and literature and history, as you will realize as he speaks to us this morning. This is the last of the 5 lectures commemorating the 500 years since Luther launched what we know as the Reformation, but which we're referring to here as the Reformations because there was more than one involved. Nigel is the initiator of that group of lectures, and it's appropriate that he actually delivered the first of those when he gave an overview of the impact of the Reformations in the 16th century and how they've shaped the world as we know it today. And it's also appropriate that here in the 5th and final one, he should bring it closer to home as he talks about how the Reformations came to Beaconsfield. It's an early history of the impact of religious dissent in our town. Nigel.
Thank you. Let me first of all say a warm thank you to Francis, Andrew and Alan who helped me in the kitchen today. Appreciated that very much. Many of us have enjoyed our breakfast here. We are gathered here. Let's begin with prayer. Let's pray. Gracious God, we thank you for this day, for food and fellowship which we have already enjoyed. And as we look forward to the talk this morning, we thank you for the interest we can take in the history of our town. And as we hear about your people of past times, may we be challenged afresh by the call of Jesus faithfully to demonstrate the gospel in our lives and in our churches today. We seek the presence of your word and spirit to enable and empower us in this. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. So this is the last of the 5 Saturday morning talks here in Beaconsfield commemorating the 500th anniversary of Martin Luther's protest. But this morning is not directly about Luther. From now we move from the great events of Europe to the little events of this town. Let me begin with just 3 comments. First of all, anyone speaking on the history of Beaconsfield is immeasurably indebted to Julian Hunt and David Thorpe for their history of this town, which is a brilliant piece of local history. It's a treasure trove for anyone interested in the subject. So I thoroughly commend this book. And of course also Robin Pedler's little book for the 800th anniversary of the parish church. Secondly, I've got a little under an hour for this talk, and we will finish in time to mark the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. And I've far more historical material than I can possibly get into the time. That may not be a bad thing that our time is limited, because details which are proper in a written text become confusing and lengthy in a spoken presentation. At least when I do them, they do. So if you find this talk somewhat tedious and confusing in places, please remember that it could have been far, far worse. Thank you. And a necessary piece of historical information: throughout our period, Beaconsfield was in the Diocese of Lincoln. Change your geography to understand that. And connected with this, the Bishop of Lincoln had a pied-à-terre, well, no, he's a bishop, so he had a palace in Woburn. This talk is about how Reformation came to Beaconsfield. The facts of the history of Beaconsfield, and in this respect it's quite unlike neighbouring towns such as Wickham, Amersham or Chesham, combined with my personal interest as pastor of this, the oldest nonconformist church in the town, mean that aside from discussion of the pre-16th century Lollards, I'll be focusing almost entirely on the Lutheran Calvinist Reformation. Tridentine Roman Catholicism, along with Baptist traditions, are, as far as I can see, almost invisible in the town until at least the 19th century. There are, of course, Quakers aplenty from the mid-17th century, but the local meeting house is, of course, in Jordan's, and I plead geography as well as my own ignorance as an excuse for making few references to them. Even Methodism, which is anyway a variety of Anglicanism, apologies there to both, Methodism emerging in the 18th century does not seem to touch the town much before the beginning of the 19th century. So in this wider area that is very rich in varied nonconformist traditions, Beaconsfield was largely a two-church town in the later early modern period. It'll make more sense in just a moment. I put that quotation up there because I couldn't resist sharing Hensley Henson's classically Anglican, again apologies, view of nonconformity. Henson wrote those words early in his ascent through the hierarchy of the Church of England. He ended up as Bishop of Durham, and I really put that quotation up there so I could tell you the little anecdote, which is in his autobiography actually, so he had some air of self-knowledge. He tells the story of standing before a portrait of himself, the portrait of himself in his bishop's robes, and he remarking with a puzzled air, "They say that portrait makes me look proud, pompous, and prelactical." To which his colleague remarked in all bewilderment, "But to which of those epithets does your grace object?" Yeah, that's a good one. So my thesis is that Reformation touches the town through a possibly, but I can't prove it, possibly continuous line of influence from the pre-Lutheran Lollards through the Puritans of the 16th and 17th century, the post-1662 nonconformists, and on into the early years of the visible nonconformist Presbyterian, in fact, church. The terminus for this talk is in the early 18th century. At 2 points, in the latter part of the 16th century, so 1570s and 80s, and in the mid-17th century, the 1640s and 50s, Reformation came to the town officially through the parish church. But otherwise, it is the work of dissent, of nonconformity, critical of and at some distance from the Church of England presence. For the most part, that is to say, we'll be talking about people on the margins and at a critical distance from the parish church. Aside from these two exceptions then, Reformation is the work of dissent. And I'll be using that term quite a lot in this talk, so I need to offer a little definition. Dissent, as I used the word this morning, is entirely religious and not political. Now, I know the two types of dissent may merge towards the end of the 18th century in a figure such as Joseph Priestley, who was Unitarian in religion and revolutionary in politics, but that's well outside the scope of this talk, both chronologically, geographically, and theologically. So similarly, dissent does not at all in the period we're looking at refer to any kind of liberalism. The dissenters of our period rather are the hot gospelers of their day, a Puritan, or we might say evangelical ginger group, pushing for more and deeper reformation. Also here in Beaconsfield, and I cannot emphasize this too strongly, with the exception of Quakers, the dissenters are not really separatists. And when they emerge as Presbyterians at the end of the 17th century, they witness to their Puritan desire, tragically unfulfilled, for comprehension in a properly reformed Church of England rather than toleration of a separate existence. They want, that is to say, they want to be included in a properly reformed national church. But of course, after the Act of Toleration in 1689, their only future is as a separate sect. That was the Presbyterian viewpoint characteristic there in the 17th century. 17th century Congregationalists and Baptists tended to be already separatists, and they wanted toleration, not comprehension. I hope that's clear. As good a definition as any of dissent was given in the early 18th century by none other than Daniel Defoe, the great English novelist, and so much more than a novelist, of course, who himself came from a nonconformist family from the Restoration era. And here's his definition. He's a bit tongue-in-cheek, but I think he's rather good. The dissenter is an Englishman that being something desirous of going to heaven, having heard his Church of England father and schoolmaster and the minister of the parish talk much of it, begins seriously to inquire about the way thither, and to that purpose, consulting his Bible and his conscience, he finds that in his opinion there are some things in the established way of worship which do not seem to correspond to the rule he has found out in the Scripture. Okay, they were wordy and lengthy there in the beginning of the 18th century. But Defoe, I think, here is meaning to indicate the Presbyterian tradition from which he himself had come. But his definition neatly includes what I'll call pre-Reformation reformers. And so our story begins not with Martin Luther's 1517 protest, but it goes back, if you like, to before the beginning. So let's introduce, shall we, the Lollards, and we've got two lovely 17th century Puritan appropriations of the earlier Lollard tradition. The name Lollard was first used of the followers of John Wycliffe at the close of the 14th century. Wycliffe himself had died in 1384. The Lollards were one of several late medieval reforming groups, such as the earlier Waldensians in northern Italy, the later Hussites in Central Europe, the Beghards indeed in the Low Countries. Strikingly anticipating the teachings of the 16th century Reformation in many ways, the Lollards were passionate about the importance of preaching, freeing the Bible from the control of the church, and making translations available in the common tongue. And from that rediscovery of the Word of God followed characteristically Lollard protests against transubstantiation, clerical celibacy, the consecration of physical objects, prayer for the dead, pilgrimages, images, the excessive preoccupation of the church with ornaments, confession to a priest, the secular authority of the bishops, and the subordination of the English church to Rome. That's a good summary there of Lollard protests. There's quite a lot that they didn't like. Not surprisingly, persecution drove these ideas underground, as it were, but they appear to have been popular through the 15th century and after. And Lollardy was persistent in the Chilterns and the mid-Thames Valley, most visible, it seems, in sporadic persecution through the 15th and early 16th centuries. So in 1428, the rector of Hedgerley was tried as being suspect concerning the sacrament of the altar, pilgrimages, and the adoration of images, all characteristically Lollard concerns. At his first appearance, some of his replies were deemed unsatisfactory, so he was sent to the Bishop of Lincoln for further examination. An ominous statement there. I don't quite know what the outcome was. At the same time, a former vicar of Chesham was forced to repudiate his errors after being accused of teaching heresy. It's not clear whether he was teaching the heresy in Chesham or in London, where he was prosecuted. In the 1460s, there were many prosecutions of Lollards at Henley and at Wickham. And by the 1520s, the records of Longlands, Bishop of Lincoln's persecutions, show clearly that Lollard ideas had taken root in the Chilterns, more especially in the Amersham area. If the evidence of one group of witnesses is true, the Lollards had virtual control of Amersham. even if that's an exaggeration, Thompson concludes, this is a writer on later Lollardy, he says, it's clear from the numbers of persons accused in Amersham, they must have formed more than an insignificant minority. And it's interesting to speculate, actually, that the long periods of Lollard invisibility may not necessarily be a sign of weakness or small numbers. That Beaconsfield had its own Lollards is clear from the proceedings taken against Richard White and his son-in-law Bennet Ward of Beaconsfield, who were among those from this area who in 1521 were hauled before the Bishop of Lincoln, Bishop John Longland, and they abjured. So they got off by saying sorry. There's an account of this in John Fox's book of, we call it Book of Martyrs, it's the Acts and Monuments of John Fox. I'll come on to that in a moment. So Richard White, father-in-law to Bennet Ward, he was detected by Robert Carder to be a known man, and that's one of the ways in which the Lollards were described. They were known men. Because after the death of Bishop Smith, he was heard to say these words, "My Lord Bishop that is dead was a good man, and divers known men," that's Lollards, "were called before him, but he didn't send them to the stake. He sent them home again, bidding them they should live among their neighbours as good Christians should do." So Smith's a good bishop. And now, okay, so we're missing a W there. Now he said there is a new bishop who is called a blessed man, and if he be as he is named, he will not trouble the servants of God, he means his fellow Lollards, but will let them be quiet. Well, that's not what happened. Okay, we're quoting from Fox's Book of Martyrs, proper title. Well, I won't read it all out because it's too long. That whole paragraph there is the title of the book. They knew how to give books titles in those days. But a very good record, actually, compiled in the Elizabethan era of the persecutions, religious persecution. I'll make reference now to a Victorian historian who was a past minister of this church, W.H. Summers. He has a history of the Lollards in the Chiltern area, and he puts it like this. He says, at Beaconsfield, going back to 1521, at Beaconsfield, Richard White and his son-in-law Bennet Ward carried on the uncouth processes of the old woolen manufacturers, treading or walking the cloth, bleaching it, and teasing it with teasel heads to raise a nap. Both of them came under suspicion and had to abjure. Ward had in his possession the Gospels of Matthew and Mark and the 10 Commandments in English. So that's bad. He had sheltered one Thomas Pope in his house, and his wife and daughter had been heard to say that Mr. Pope was the devoutest man that ever was in their house, for he would sit reading his book till midnight many times. Well, that's quite unusual back there in the beginning of the 16th century. And one John Marston testified that Ward had said, "It booteth no man to pray to Our Lady, nor to any saint or angel in heaven, but to God only. For they," Our Lady and the saints, "have no power over a man's soul." Again, this was a revolutionary talk in 1521. An interesting link, actually, between 16th century Reformation and the remnants of 14th century Reform. Longlands, the Bishop of Lincoln's heretic hunt in the 1520s, in 1521, may have been inspired by Cardinal Wolsey's mass burning of Luther's books in St. Paul's churchyard in May 1521. That was going on in London, and Longland was persecuting the Lollards here in this area. Now we know, and I hope this is common knowledge, that Longland's investigations in Amersham in 1521 delivered 6 people to the secular authorities to be burned. Thomas Bernard, James Morden, Robert Rev'd, John Scrivener, Joan Norman and Thomas Holmes. Those are 6 of the Amersham martyrs. The 7th, William Tilesworth, had been burned in 1511, and another Amersham resident, Thomas Chase, was murdered, probably murdered, while imprisoned in the Bishop of Lincoln's palace in Woburn. And those names, of course, are also carefully recounted in Fox's famous Elizabethan Book of Martyrs. And many of you be familiar with the Martyrs' Memorial in the field just above Old Amersham. Well worth a visit sometime. There can be little doubt that Lollardy was sufficiently active on the eve of the Reformation to make some contribution to the development of English Protestantism. Indeed, we've got a fine example of old Buckinghamshire Lollardy being renewed by Lutheranism in the figure of Thomas Harding. Not quite sure where in Bucks he was. Thomas Harding, who had 3 times recanted as a Lollard, well, that's quite impressive, under 3 different bishops of Lincoln, and who in 1532 was caught in possession of various writings by William Tyndale, including an English New Testament. And church historian Margaret Bowker writes about this. With such a library, Harding was able to read and to teach his fellow Lollards some of the salient Lutheran tenets and encourage them to persist in their own views. And then she goes on to say, and this is quite important, Lollardy had ceased to be the creed of weavers and threshers and was now to be fed and changed by the graduates who supported Luther, and who, like Tyndale, went abroad in order to publish books for their fellow countrymen. It's been estimated then that even here in Beaconsfield, maybe as many as 10% of the population might have been sympathetic to the Lollard cause in the 1520s. And that's an equivalent proportion to Rickmansworth, which had its own Lollard meeting place, and a higher proportion than High Wycombe Pen, or indeed almost anywhere else in the area except Little Missenden, Amersham and Chesham. And although there was no meeting place we know of here in Beaconsfield for the small number of Lollard sympathisers, it's possible they could have attended meetings in Amersham. It would be treasure for the local historian to be able to trace the connections, the names of individuals or families that link old Lollardy and the take-up of the new Lutheran Calvinist teaching, to find links between the names of 1521, the Lollards, and the visible 17th century Puritans. But we don't seem to have that sort of detail in this area because, and this is not my words, it's words of an historian, Nestor Evans, because of the patchiness in this area of the ecclesiastical records. So I'm going to move on now to the Elizabethan church, so moving on for 50 years or so into the 1570s. The Elizabethan period, the latter half of the 16th century, was the time when the Reformed settlement, and I'm talking here about the prayer book and the 39 articles of the Church of England, were embedded in the local churches. Here is the first of the 2 points when Reformation comes not by dissent, such as the earlier Lollards and the later Nonconformists, but officially from and through the parish church itself. So, just go back in history. The Church of England under Elizabeth I and under James I, or James VI if you like, is officially Calvinist. The succession of bishops, certainly Grindal, Whitgift and Abbot, archbishops, and notable bishops such as John Jewel, they were all Calvinist in their doctrine, although many of them resisted further reformation of practice that the Puritans demanded. The Lutheran Calvinist Reformation was the official agenda of the Elizabethan Church, and it's in the latter part of the 16th century that this Reformation comes to most of the parishes, and Beaconsfield is no exception. If we look at the 16th century incumbents of the parish of Beaconsfield, a good place for us to start is one Nicholas Taverner. Taverner was educated at Hart Hall, Oxford, the precursor of today's Hertford College. Taverner was the first rector of Beaconsfield to be appointed in the reign of Elizabeth. His predecessor had managed to survive from certainly the time of Mary through quite well into Elizabeth's reign. Nicholas Taverner arrived then here in 1576 and remained rector until 1589. What's interesting about Taverner is that in 1582 he's licensed by the then Archbishop of Canterbury as a preacher for most of the diocese of the province of Canterbury. Clearly he was on message as regards the official teaching of the Elizabethan Church, and he had the patronage of the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was Edmund Grindal. And you say, who's Edmund Grindal? Okay, Edmund Grindal was one of a number of impeccably reformed, Calvinist Elizabethan bishops, and one of those most open to further reform in the church. He'd been an exile in Protestant Strasbourg during the reign of Mary. He returned to England in 1559 with a twofold calling: to consolidate the reformed settlement of the Church of England and to further the reform of the practice, that is to say, the worship of the Church.
As Bishop of London, as he was before he became Archbishop of Canterbury, he had seen it as his duty to send out the evangelists and pastors capable of erecting within his diocese a godly, reformed and instructed church. And he continued to seek to form a godly preaching ministry and a profound moral transformation of society, which was to come about, he saw, not through legislation, not through the overhaul of institutions, but by the religious force of Protestantism itself in its apostolate at the grassroots. I'm quoting Patrick Collinson, the historian there. What is the significance then of Grindal to our story of Beaconsfield? If Grindal appointed Taverner as a preacher to forward the work of the Reformation in the province of Canterbury, then we can reasonably assume that Taverner shared in and already brought to Beaconsfield the Puritan teaching and practice of his patron. It's reasonable to assume that under Taverner, if not before, Calvinist reform teaching and practice openly, even officially, took root. And that it did so is evident, I suggest, by the size and the influence of the Puritan party in Beaconsfield 40 years later. There's a picture of Edmund Grindal. I'll leave that up just for a moment because we got two 17th or just pretty much 17th century views of Grindal. Richard Baxter, who thinks he's the best thing since sliced bread, and Henry Sacheverell, notorious high church Tory troublemaker really at the beginning of the 18th century, and he calls Grindal that perfidious prelate who deluded Elizabeth the Queen into tolerating the Genevan discipline and thereby facilitating the first plantation of dissenters. That's all part of the debates of, really Queen Anne's reign at the beginning of the 18th century. Two figures looking back there on Grindal. We're going to move on fairly swiftly into the 17th century. I love that quotation of John Coffey. Church of England in the 17th century. For Puritans, it was only half reformed. For the Laudians, followers of William Laud, it was too reformed by half. Yeah, it's a good one. If you can follow through Patrick Collinson's account of 17th century English religion, you'll have a great picture of what happens. But I'm just going to leave that slide up there and you can read it while I carry on. The waves of change from the Calvinist Jacobean court, or Jacobean Calvinism, through the reaction in the figure of William Laud, Archbishop later, and the reaction against that with the Presbyterians, and then against Presbyterians, the Independents react against them, and everyone takes fright at the sects, that means the Quakers, and then of course the Anglicans return, the Anglican revenge of the Restoration that follows in 1660. If you understand that, you understand everything really about English 17th century religion. I said Calvinism and moderate Puritanism was the dominant influence in the Church of England until the closing years of James I and the accession of his son Charles I. But certainly by the 1630s, there was a vigorous reaction against that, led by one William Laud. There he is, another worthy in his bishop's gowns.
William Laud took over in 1633 as Archbishop of Canterbury, took over from the very pro-Puritan and Calvinist George Abbot, and Laud and his allies were deeply hostile to the Calvinism and the Puritanism of preceding generations. They were determined to change the Church of England yet again and to establish Arminian theology and Catholic ceremonies and practices. You say, what is Arminian theology? The name comes out of debates in the Netherlands and the Remonstrance of 1610 associated with Jacob Arminius. Hugh Grotius, of course, is a great figure in the history of thought in many ways. And against that remonstrance, which is complaining about Calvinism, the Calvinists got back at them at the Synod of Dort. And if you ever sit and read the canons, as they're called, of the Synod of Dort, they are very robust in their theology. Although many practices that Laud introduced into the Church of England in the 1630s are today seen as being ancient traditions, at the time they were seen to be innovations. Again, Patrick Collinson, great historian, still alive I think, he points out it was the high Anglicanism of the time, the 1630s, Arminian doctrine and Laudian formalism, which appeared strange and novel in the 1630s, whereas what we take for Puritanism would have been widely equated with orthodoxy. So try and hold that thought, because it's counter to what you're probably thinking. A list of Laudian priorities, the priorities of William Laud, I've got them up there. The holiness of the church. Yep, you can't, and the churchyard. Who was it? John Hampden got into real trouble for holding a muster in the churchyard here at Beaconsfield, because churchyards weren't supposed to be used for things like that. The priority of prayer, the devaluation of preaching. Yep, all those long Puritan sermons, no, throw them out. The focus on the altar. The Lord's table had been moved forward into the congregation. Now says Lord, no, put it back at the east end and enclose it, fence it off as a holy place, bowing to the altar, kneeling to receive sacraments. These were all things that Laud was trying to introduce in the 1630s. Very much against the Puritan emphasis on the Sabbath day, very much for the recovery of holy days. Against the Puritan emphasis on the Sabbath day that they promoted the King's Book of Sports, saying that people must go and play games and drink beer on Sunday afternoons, and they couldn't possibly come back to church for worship. All those sorts of things are going on. The clericalism, setting the priest apart from as the holy person. The enforcement of matters previously considered indifferent. There'd been quite a lot of tolerance there in that Puritan-led Church of England, but Laud was very detailed. Things all had to be done one way, one law for the church as there was one law for the country. And of course it was very anti-Puritan. The Puritan religion is rebellion and their faith is faction. That's as if to say they are treasonable, as it were. That's a quotation from a contemporary of Laud, Haler or someone like that. Right. How does this relate to Beaconsfield is what you want to hear. In the early 1630s, the rector of the parish church was one Dr. John Andrews, and records from the calendars of state papers show that Andrews is acting as a Laudian informer, reporting on events in South Bucks to one of Laud's lieutenants, Sir John Lamb. And in these communications, Andrews, rector of Beaconsfield, defines himself in this way, as not inclining in any way to Puritanism, where with the greatest number both the priests and people in these parts, talking about South Bucks, are foully tainted, inasmuch as he is called the most godly, who can and will be the most disobedient to the orders of the church. And Andrews goes on to speak with disdain of the profane and irreligious Puritan neglect of divine service and the beastly irreverence that is commonly used at it. Andrews, as rector, is constantly battling Puritanism, both in Beaconsfield and in the wider area. There are lots of stories here, lots of things he sent as an informer. But one of the stories is this. In June 1536, Mr. Bradshaw, who was the vicar of St. Peter's, Chalfont, sought advice from Andrews on whether he might allow presumably Puritan lectures in the church on Sunday afternoons. Andrews writes, Bradshaw, said that he had been most violently importuned thereunto by some newcomers to his parish, especially Mr. Pennington, a citizen, who, when Mr. Bradshaw made some difficulty, fell upon the Archbishop, i.e. complained about Laud's policies, saying, since this same pragmatical bishop kept his visitation, the Archbishop had indeed held a visitation in the area just shortly before that, there is a great gap opened up for the increasing of popery and the spreading of Arminianism. To add insult to, this is Pennington saying this, to add insult to injury, even Mr. Pennington's gardener, so Bradshaw reports, is vocal in his objection to bowing at the name of Jesus as a ceremony in worship, and to a presumed assertion of universal redemption in the prayer book. Oh dear. This Mr. Pennington was the prosperous London businessman Isaac Pennington, whose clash with the vicar of Chalfont St. Peter was part of his Puritan agenda, which later led him to be elected as a London sheriff in 1638, MP in the short parliament, then in the long parliament, Lord Mayor in 1642, think what was happening to the country in 1642, implicated in the events surrounding the death of Charles I, and who was imprisoned in the Tower of London at the Restoration, where he died on December the 16th, 1661. And his son, also Isaac Pennington, gets a bit confusing, joined the Society of Friends in 1657 and was one of the Quaker leaders in this area. His stepdaughter married William Penn. And Isaac Pennington Jr. is mentioned in 1669 as leading Quaker meetings in Amersham and Chalfont St. Giles, and his house, the Bury, was in the latter parish. Come back to the 1630s. Andrews responds, so the rector here responds to Bradshaw's question by quoting the full force of the law. The gardener's speeches were directly against the 4th and 6th canons, and those of Mr. Pennington were scandalum magnatum, wherefore he ought to complain, i.e. report them to the authorities. But Andrews comments sadly after that, though a well-meaning man, he, that's the Reverend Mr. Bradshaw, like all the rest of the clergy in these parts, is so overawed by the pro-Puritan justices and lay gentry that he is wonderful timorous. Yeah. Andrews had complained in 1634 that Beaconsfield was foully tainted with Puritanism, and that lots of people used to gad from our services on Sunday to hear puritanical sermons in other parishes, contrary to the law, says Andrews. Indeed, Andrews seems to describe Beaconsfield as a parish where Puritanism was pervasive, even affecting the church wardens. Andrews can't even trust his own church wardens. Writing to Dr. Farmery, who was Chancellor of Lincoln, another of Laud's supporters, Andrews indicates his dissatisfaction with his church wardens and his parish. I suppose lots of incumbents might do that, but this is Andrews' reason for doing that. He says, unless church wardens be severely proceeded against, there will be no tolerable reformation, but he doesn't mean by that what I might mean by reformation. Andrews enumerates the things out of order in his parish. No terrier of church lands. I'm not going to stop to explain terriers. If you want to know what a terrier is, go and ask Jeremy. I'm sure he'll give you a lovely answer to that. Elections held in the church, using the church building for something as secular as an election. No, you can't do that. Gadding on Sundays to hear puritanical sermons in other parishes. Few come to church on holy days. Many sit at service with their hats on. Some lie upon the pews. Yeah. Many kneel not at prayers, nor bow at the name of Jesus. And even the church wardens do not levy the 12 pence, the shilling fine, from those who absent themselves from divine service. Andrews begs Dr. Farmery to do his endeavour, that all may walk after one rule. That's a very Laudian idea, everyone following all the same practice. The things Andrew is complaining about here don't demonstrate a lack of interest in worship. He may call the Puritans irreligious. No, they were not irreligious. They just had a different idea of what it was to be religious. So kneeling, bowing at the name of Jesus, marking holy days, these were Laudian ceremonials, precisely what the Puritans objected to on religious grounds. Lying on the seats, yes, I'm not sure about that. I suspect it's a bit of an exaggeration. May indicate a lack of respect for the priest. But the other complaints, as I say, show not that the people are irreligious, but they are too zealously Puritan. Though, of course, Andrews would have said that the two were the same. And clearly, many of them are choosing to worship outside the parish church, either at other parish churches where there's a more Puritan preaching, or maybe in separate meetings. And again, this is happening with the complicity of the church wardens, who are not enforcing the law. It was a law dating back to the time of Elizabeth that made attendance at the parish church compulsory, and a fine of £1 if you weren't there on a Sunday morning. Lots more to say about Andrews. I'm going to move on. Andrews' successor in the parish church was one George Ashton, who on his appointment here was also already incumbent of another parish in North Bucks. So Ashton then was what's called a pluralist. He took the money from two parishes, but only lived and only served in one. Which was not something likely to endear him to his more spiritual parishioners. Let's skip on, shall we? Because we need to come to the 1640s and 50s. We're looking now at this period of the Civil War and the Protectorate under Oliver Cromwell, and I'll leave those quotations up there for you to puzzle over. In 70% of parish churches, the Civil War brought no change of incumbent. But Beaconsfield was not one of those 70%. If you go into the parish church, you'll see on the board of previous incumbents the name of one Hugh Butler. I'm not sure if I managed to get that. Yeah, okay, this is a dreadful photograph. It won't help you in the slightest, but that's what you're looking for if you go into the parish church. On that board in the parish church, he's described as rector from 1650 to 1660, but those dates are incorrect. It's earlier than 1650 for sure. With the Restoration fervour, he's described as an intruder. Can we see him up there? Yeah, Hugh Butler, there we go. There's something that says intruder up there. Hasn't come out very clearly. But this is a contentious term. Was he an intruder? No, well, not really. He was certainly not appointed by the patron of the living. No, that's right. But he was appointed by the legal processes of the time. We're talking about the 1644, 1645. Legal processes that were, of course, themselves invalidated by Restoration legislation. So 1660, Parliament acts to undo all the legislation that had been passed over the years of the interregnum, as you might describe them. They were not quite in the interregnum yet. So let's look at the process. With Butler, Beaconsfield gets what many of its residents had long desired. For his appointment is the second occasion that reform comes through the official channels, when reform is not the work of dissent. Let's look just briefly at the process by which Butler was quite lawfully for his time appointed. Although the historic Church of England episcopate was only abolished later, the outbreak of the Civil War in 1642 rendered episcopal administration virtually impossible. Responsibility for the church then fell upon Parliament, which was receiving many petitions concerning local churches and attempting to provide ministry in areas affected by the fighting. In 1642, Parliament set up a committee for for Plundered Ministers. It also set up a rather delightful committee called the Committee for Scandalous Ministers. And you may think that we should still have a committee like that to this day. Parliament set up these committees to provide suitable Puritan incumbents for parish churches. Now, what happened here in Beaconsfield, we're not quite sure of the details. The facts seem to be that Ashton's Beaconsfield living was sequestered, talk about that in a moment, before the 22nd of January 1644, or 1645 really because of the New Year date, which is when Hugh Butler was admitted by the authority of the county committee, the Parliamentary County Committee. This appointment was confirmed by the Committee for Plundered Ministers on May the 2nd of 1646. So Ashton, who already had 2 livings anyway, was kicked out of Beaconsfield and presumably sent back to his other church in North Bucks, and one Hugh Butler was instituted as the rector of the parish. What do we know about Hugh Butler? The most solid piece of evidence comes after the 1689 Act of Toleration, when the nonconformist writer Edmund Calamy, I won't go into all those details, recording the sufferings of the Puritan clergy after 1660, mentions Hugh Butler and describing him as something like a very grave and solemn divine, which is Puritan speak for a jolly good fellow, all right? His subsequent career, Butler's subsequent career as leader of illegal Presbyterian conventicles, illegal meetings for worship, in Uxbridge, confirms his churchmanship. He's a Presbyterian. He's clearly a good Puritan. He shared their belief that the Church of England was only half reformed, and he comes to Beaconsfield to complete the work, as it were. Of course, he's only here for those 15 or 16 years or whatever it is. After being ejected at the Restoration, Butler later preached, as I said, in Uxbridge, where he was presented to the authorities for prosecution by the church wardens there in 1673. That was after the brief 1672 indulgence that Charles II had proclaimed. Butler was presented for holding a conventicle at the Three Swans Inn, worship at the Three Swans Inn. In these records, he's always listed as a Presbyterian. And just a link to a bit further on, when Butler died, he died in Winchmore Hill in 1682, one of the witnesses of his will was one William Cole, a tallow chandler in Beaconsfield, and that name reappears throughout the early 18th century, and in 1693 a dwelling of one William Cole is registered for nonconformist worship, so that's that link between Hugh Butler and the nonconformists as they appear in the 1690s, when they're finally able to register buildings and to meet legally. I'm skipping on. Save your questions till later. We're coming on now to the Restoration. Richard Baxter, great figure in the thick of these things. Baxter's in Kidderminster. He keeps voluminous diaries, lots of interesting things. And nice comment there from Samuel Pepys. He's absolutely spot on about that. And the lovely story about Ralph Jocelyn, who was as Puritan as anyone, and 1662, on St. Bartholomew's Day, he should have been thrown out of the Church of England because he didn't subscribe to the prayer book and the requirements of the Act of Uniformity. But Anglican bureaucracy was not infallible, and no one noticed. So he stayed on he was expecting to be thrown out. They didn't come for him. He continued for the next 20 years or so to hold his position, only being occasionally ticked off for not wearing a surplice. So a nice little story there. You know, of course, in 1660, Charles Stuart returns from exile at the invitation of the Convention Parliament, while the Independents and the other separatists had hoped that some other long-term solution could be found after the death of Cromwell. Remember, John Milton writes pleading for the liberty of England, because he doesn't want the king to come back. The Presbyterians are different. Including General Monk at the head of the Scottish Army, the Presbyterians were foremost in desiring the return of the monarchy. Just as sadly later they willingly joined the Cavaliers in sending most of they were Congregationalist regicides, those who were involved in the death of Charles I, to the scaffold, one of those acts of revenge of the Restoration. Tragically, Parliament laid down no conditions for the King's return. Charles, before coming back to the country, spoke some very fine words. He declared a liberty to tender consciences. He said that while he was still in the Netherlands, but he did not deliver on his promise. And certainly, whether he was sincere or not, we don't know, but the bishops and the Cavaliers wanted revenge on the Puritans, and they got it in the Acts of Uniformity of 1662 and subsequent legislation, which, if you've done your history, you'll know as the Clarendon Code. It's small print there, but a whole raft of legislation aimed at persecuting the Puritans, those who would not subscribe to the requirements of that Restoration Church of England. Those acts applied to all the nonconformists, but the Quakers got a double whammy because they had a special act that was out to get them. So the Quakers suffered worst of all at that time of the Restoration, and hundreds, thousands went to prison, and some died in prison simply for their religious belief. So, 1662, Act of Nonconformity, of course, here in Beaconsfield. Ashton didn't wait for that. Ashton wanted to get his living back, and he did. Hugh Butler was chucked out. The legislation of the Act of Uniformity was actually said that the ministers who were thrown out of the Church of England because they couldn't conform were to be treated as if they were naturally dead. Treated as if they were dead. In all their legal entitlements were disappeared. They were thrown out with not a penny to their name. And about 2,000 people were thrown out, ministers were thrown out at that time. If you look in Hunt and Thorpe here, Julian Hunt says, after this English Civil War, a substantial part of the population, particularly the tradesmen and shopkeepers, followed the ejected minister Hugh Butler and founded the Congregational Church. That sentence is wrong in a number of ways. Apologies to Julian. Because, first of all, there's no evidence that they founded any sort of meeting immediately after the Restoration. Secondly, it wasn't led by Hugh Butler. The 5 Mile Act meant he had to go somewhere else to do his preaching. And thirdly, it never appears as a congregational church until about 100 years later. So take that with a pinch of salt. But you do wonder what happened to all those Puritans who had loved the ministry of Hugh Butler. He goes, Ashton comes back, they don't like Ashton, what do? Where are they? Are they visible? How do we find out about them? If you look at the census returns that the Anglican rector has to fill in occasionally for the bishop or the archbishop, they don't seem to be very visible. So 1669, Reverend Samuel Gardiner, lately arrived as the rector of Beaconsfield. He comes after Ashton. He responds to Archbishop Sheldon's questionnaire with the following assurances: I do truly certify that upon diligent inquiry in our parish of Beaconsfield, we have no conventicles, unlawful assemblies, or unlawful church meetings, but all our parish do unanimously come on Sunday unto our parish church to hear divine service and preaching, except 2 or 3 Quakers, or at least inclined in that way. But whether they go to any private meetings I know not, nor can hear by any in our parish. So that's right, yeah, okay. So according to Gardiner, all is well. But that can't be the whole story. We got a series of these censuses, and they give very little information of nonconformists or dissenters in the town in the 1660s, 70s, and 80s. Why is this? Well, first of all, great pressure on the rector to say all is well. We're not a troublesome parish. Don't bother us. Just leave us alone. Secondly, the people we're looking for are not the troublemakers, like the Quakers. They're upstanding citizens who just want a properly reformed church. So what are they doing? Well, they're going to divine service on a Sunday morning, probably with their hats on and lying on along the chairs. But then in the afternoon, they're going off to hear real preaching, which is to say Puritan preaching, somewhere else. They're either going to Amersham. George Swinhoe is ministering there in Amersham in a nonconformist meeting, or High Wycombe. He's doing the same thing actually. Or they're going to Woburn, where Lord Wharton has a big house and a private chapel, and Lord Wharton invites all the great nonconformists of the age to come and stay at his house and to preach in his chapel. And being a lord, he's got some protection against the law. Okay, I'm just going to just a moment, and then we'll move on to our time of silence. We're going on to 1688 and the Glorious Revolution. A great change in events then. It's only in the aftermath of 1688 and the reasonably secure tolerance that followed, but not the comprehension that the Presbyterians sought, that we see positive evidence of visible dissenting meetings in Beaconsfield. If you're puzzling over that, Philip Henry was a contemporary there in the 17th century. He's the father of Matthew Henry, if any of you know Matthew Henry's commentary on the Bible. And Philip Henry is in North Wales. He's a Presbyterian. He's been thrown out of his church in 1662. He stays in the area. He attends parish church every Sunday morning because he believes in the parish system and the national church. And then in the afternoon and the evening, he goes and preaches his Puritan sermons elsewhere. And his account of 1688, or 1689, the Act of Tolerance, and he says here, the Act of Uniformity had said that we were dead. Yeah, treated as if they were naturally dead. But what has happened now, the Act of Tolerance has said that we can legally meet again, and it's like a resurrection for us nonconformists. And the ministers in black going to say thank you to William and Mary in London. A scoffer, whether are all these going? They're dressed in black. Are they going to burial? No, sir, said one of them. We're going to a resurrection. I'm just going to go very quickly through the last little bit, just to take us up into the 18th century, and I'm not going to go any further than that, I promise. So after the Act of Toleration in 1689, it is possible for places to be registered for nonconformist, Protestant nonconformist public worship. And the names that are mentioned in the registrations for Beaconsfield nearly all reappear in the life of the dissenting congregation in the 18th century. So there is a follow-through from that 1690s through to the records we have later on in the 18th century. The earliest registration for Beaconsfield is in 1693. William Cole, grocer, and Thomas Briers, carpenter. They register their dwellings for nonconformist worship. 4 years later, Samuel Clark, gentleman, applies for registration. Then William Woods is mentioned in 1689. I like that registration by William Woods because he's the proprietor of the White Hart. So I console myself that, should this building ever burn down and we go to meet for worship in the White Hart, we will be following ancient tradition, as it were. There are a couple of other names also. 9 registrations in 20 years for nonconformist worship here in Beaconsfield. I think that suggests a community struggling to find a suitable long-term home. But over the country as a whole, there were some 2,500 places of nonconformist worship registered between 1691 and 1710. And it's estimated that something over 5% of the population at that point are nonconformists and now able to worship openly as nonconformists. I suspect that it's a higher percentage, but that's what's quoted. So, out of the seeming confusion of the registrations in the 1690s, a clearly defined worshipping congregation emerges by the early 1700s. We've got records of this in the returns by the rectors of the parish. So in 1706, Christopher Newell, rector, says there is a Presbyterian meeting house here in Beaconsfield. Although he says there's few or no dissenters except a Quaker or two. Evidence that when he talks about dissenters, he's not thinking about the Presbyterians in their meeting house. He's thinking again about those troublesome Quakers. Again, if we go on a little bit later, we've got another record here from a few years later where there is the Presbyterians meet every Lord's Day, every Sunday, about 100 in number. Many from the neighbouring parishes. Samuel Clarke is their teacher, their leader, their preacher, as it were. I think that's 1709. I love this. I'm just going to throw this out. 100 Presbyterians plus meeting at that time. At the same time, the figure for the communicants at Easter at the parish church is 50. Now, I'm not saying you can make any comparison between the two. I just want to throw those figures out for interest. Okay. So, we got other evidence. 1712, Browns-Willis talks of 15 families of Presbyterians meeting here. Doesn't sound a lot, but it's obviously a bigger congregation. 1715, the thing called the Evans Manuscript says that Samuel Clarke is pastor of a Presbyterian church here with a congregation of about 180. And you know that when we come on to the 19th century, the quoted congregations for all the churches in Beaconsfield are vast, but the quoted congregation here, morning, afternoon and evening, is really quite astronomical. I only hope they were accurate in their figures and not exaggerating in any way. So, by the 1690s, then, I'll conclude, it's clear that the dissenting community that was once, I'm suggesting, Lollard, then Puritan, then underground nonconformist, has crystallized out into the Presbyterian Church, which becomes visible under the leadership of Samuel Clarke. The Puritan hopes for further reformation of the Church of England, those hopes are alive during the time of Archbishop Grindal and our Nicholas Taverner here in Beaconsfield, which almost seemed to come to fruition when Hugh Butler was rector here in the time of the Civil War and the Protectorate. Those hopes are dashed. The intransigence of Tory landowners and Anglican bishops closed the door on comprehension. The liberal solution of toleration has been enshrined in law, 1689. Beaconsfield has become, as a matter of fact, a two-church town. The Presbyterian congregation flourishes in the early 18th century. In time it becomes independent or congregationalist. You can't have a Presbyterian church on its own. It makes no sense. So they end up being independent. It becomes congregational. Sure, they're Protestant, so of course the congregation fragments and meets in different places because they can't agree, but they do come back together again, and it's nice to recall that in 1800, this hall in which we now meet was built as the Congregational Church. Even then, of course, discreetly set back from the road behind a row of cottages, reflecting the precarious position of nonconformity still through the 18th century. And it's not until the 1870s that, needing to enlarge because the effects of the Oxford movement were convulsing the parish church, the Congregationalists brashly dared to build their new sanctuary there on the main road, there on Aylesbury End. But of course, by that time, our friends at the Methodist Church were establishing their presence in the town. Beginning of the 19th century, they come. And in the early 20th century, the new town becomes home to a Baptist congregation, now Hope Church, and the Roman Catholic Church, St. Teresa's, not to mention, of course, St. Michael's, and in Hotspur, St. Thomas's. And so, remarkably, the variety of church life was established, which we still see in our town today. A variety that I would suggest is something to be celebrated, not lamented. For the richness of worship, of scriptural treasure and theological depth cannot be captured in any one church building, nor in any one human tradition. Together, so long as we have the charity to recognize each other as brothers and sisters in Christ, together we represent the Church of God here in this town. And we each have some precious strand of Christian insight to bring to the others. And I hope and pray that those of us who represent the oldest and most continuous strand of religious dissent in this town will continue gently but firmly to challenge our fellow Christians with the precious insights of that Lutheran Calvinist Reformation, which it has been our joy, and I hope yours, to celebrate this autumn. Thank you.
I think we're all ready. If you'd like to put questions to Nigel, and if you put your hand up, I'll bring the microphone round so that your question can be recorded. And here's the first one.
Nigel, thank you very much indeed. My question is this. If I was a Catholic living in 1517, where would I have gone to Mass?
In 1517? Okay, so in 1517, you'd have had Mass in the local parish church. Yeah, no question about that. Yeah, it was St Mary's, the buildings. I mean, it was renovated in the towards the end of the 19th century, but you can see there are pictures of what it looked like. It's not substantially different. You'd have gone to Mass there, and if you look at wills, so when people wrote their wills and they leave money for candles to be put on the altar and so on, the area is predominantly, of course, medieval Catholic. What's interesting is that you've also got alongside that, you've got this consistent Lollard movement, and the things, that by the mid or the later part of the 16th century, you've got quite a substantial Reformed Puritan presence here, I think. And that's very clear in the decades that follow. 1517, nothing's changed here in 1517. It's very interesting. I've got another talk about the rectors of at the beginning of the 16th century and what they were doing, because Beaconsfield's not far from Windsor, it's not far from London, and so they're mixed up in court things, and they've been trained in law at Bologna, and they're high. Some of them at least are high flyers. And an interesting lot, but that's another talk, if that's all right.
Okay, thank you, Nigel. My question relates to the previous one. When did the first rector, or Protestant rector, take over? What was? Can you tell us anything about that sort of changeover?
Okay, so that's really quite hard to say. I mean, what I was talking about Nicholas Taverner coming here in 1576, but obviously, you've got the same rector. I'll need to look at the names. You've got the same rector from the time of Mary. These dates aren't always right, but let's just assume that they are. Thomas Goodrich. Okay, 1554, first year or so of Mary's reign, everything's gone back to being Roman Catholic, or Catholic, medieval Catholic, I suppose, really. He's here until 1576. Okay, so he survives Mary's reign, and in 1560 or 1560, he's got to go back to using Cranmer's prayer book, 52 prayer book, whatever it is, he's got to follow the rites and the ceremonies laid down in that book. He's the same person who celebrated the Mass, one Sunday, and then presumably celebrates Cranmer's Lord's Supper the next Sunday. Wouldn't it be lovely, to find some resident here in Beaconsfield who kept a diary and said, do you know what the rector did last Sunday or did this Sunday? As I'm sure you are all keeping diaries of that nature. If we had records like that, we would be over the moon. So all I can say is, what I do know is that when Taverner comes, You know, if you look at his patron, if you look at the purposes that Grindal had as Archbishop, you can say, yeah, I think we've really got a hot gospeler Puritan here, come to either to shape things up in Beaconsfield or to confirm changes that were already taking place. I can't say any more than that, unfortunately. So I can't accept, you know, because it's an act of Parliament, you know, what prayer book gets used at a certain time. So 1560 it would have changed, as it changed in 1552, as it changed in 1549, as it in various as directives come from above to tell the poor rector here what he, or his curate, because the rector may be off somewhere else, the poor person leading worship here, what they should be doing, and presumably they do what they're told, as all good clergy do.
I was struck by the fact that when this place was first established, you had to be screened from the main thoroughfare. Was this true just for Beaconsfield, or was that the common practice throughout the country?
No. By 1800, it's a bit of an anachronism, really, to say to deliberately screen it from the road. But certainly, you can find records, not here in Beaconsfield, I think, but certainly in other places, you can find records at least into the mid-18th century, into the maybe 1750s, of the rector or the church wardens going with the constable to close down some illegal act of nonconformist worship. It didn't happen much by then, but you do get odd occasions, and there is that legacy that nonconformity has a fragile... You see, 1689, the Act of Toleration is an indulgence, if you like. It doesn't undo previous legislation. It provides an indulgence for dissenters to register their buildings and so on. But there's always that sense of what's given on one occasion can be taken away at another occasion, as had happened previously. 1672, Charles II issues an indulgence, and nonconformist preachers go and get their license and everything. Parliament overturns that indulgence, and all those poor preachers who have come out into the open, have written their names on bits of paper, then of course get pursued because they're leading illegal worship. We're a bit suspicious. A bit suspicious of these opportunities that come. 1800 is a bit late for that. Maybe this was the only piece of land. I'm not sure. But it is interesting. There were cottages like the Blue Cottage all the way across along Aylesbury End. When they built that sanctuary there on the road, they had to buy up the cottages. And there was an interesting property dispute about the ownership of one, which means there is a boundary marker in the church which says, we're not sure, well, in effect, says, we're not quite sure if we own this bit of land.
Yeah, it's still there.
It's still there.
The Baptist church in Old Amersham is still hiding behind other buildings.
Yeah,
so
good.
Sorry, somebody put up their hands here?
Behind you.
I'm sorry.
Nigel, do you know where the nonconformists met before this was built?
It's all nicely detailed in our church history, which is on the website. They certainly met in a barn on the, in effect, just down the A40 was one meeting place. John, you can probably help me here, because this is going on from the bit where I left off, and I'm a bit hazy about details.
It's behind the bear, what's it called? The Crazy Bear, as it's called today.
Right.
It used to be situated there. It was known as the Old Meeting House, and the congregation split at one point, and the ones who split away were meeting in a cottage, and then they acquired this site, and subsequently, although they continued to have ownership of the Old Meeting House, the congregation there dwindled until there were only two ladies left. And they came back and joined the congregation here, and the building finally collapsed, I think. There was a horse which was badly damaged by the collapse.
Right.
And that was the end, mid-19th century.
Okay. I can tell you, actually, if we go back into the period I was talking about when Samuel Clarke was leading those Presbyterians at the very beginning of the 18th century, so, 1710 or something like that, Samuel Clarke was occupying the land that is now where Hall Place is. Hall Place is that nice, elegant Georgian building on Wickham End. Yeah. Before that was built, an interesting story about the building of that, Samuel Clarke had that and he ran it as a college, actually, of some sort. Whether he's training ministers or whether it was just a school, it's not quite clear. But probably the worship was taking place within what was the building there before Hall Place was built. Hall Place was built by either John or Thomas Briers. I mentioned them because it was Thomas, that must have been John Briers, because Thomas Briers had registered his house for nonconformist worship in the 1690s, and probably it must have been his son, John Briers, carpenter, but obviously much more than a carpenter, because he built he built the Hall Place that is not dissimilar to the one you see now. It's been renovated and changed many times. But he built that for a John Crook, who was a perfumer from Pall Mall in London. So, lots of, most of this is in Hunt and Thorpe's book, actually.
I wonder if you could tell me where the word Presbyterian what it means. Obviously, we're aware of their existence, but I wonder where the word comes from. And you mentioned Presbyterian couldn't have a church on their own. What do you mean by that?
Okay. So the origin of the word Presbyterian, it's Greek. Presbyteros, which means an elder. If you read the Greek New Testament, you'll see there are two names for leaders within the church. There's episkopos and presbyteros. Episkopos, from which we get the word bishop. Presbyteros, from which we get the word, presbyter, for example. I would contend in the New Testament they're exactly the same. There's no difference between the elder and the overseer, if you like, and that there's always a number of them in any congregation. But that's another matter. So that's where it comes from. And the word presbyter is used in other traditions for the priest, or for presbytery, for where the priest lives. Presbyterianism was, congregational churches are meant to be individual congregations on their own. They are independent. Presbyterian churches always exist in presbyteries, or that's the word for, or classes, groups in which they exercise the churches, the elders of the church, elders, presbyteros or presbyteroi, episkopoi, they exercise oversight not only over their own congregation but over the other congregations in the area. So there is a meeting of presbytery, and the elders from all the churches gather and exercise mutual oversight over the churches within that area. So that would be the presbytery, if you like. So it's always a system of synodical government is probably another way of putting it. The trouble is, if you haven't got the areas of churches working together, then it doesn't really make any sense to call it Presbyterian anymore. It becomes an isolated congregation. Well, we've got another name for that, and that's independent, or later on, congregational. So does that answer your question? Yes. Oh, well, was there another part? Yes, no, that was it.
Could you tell me when women were allowed to lead services in the non-conformed church, or the non-established church, please?
Okay. It's interesting, in the URC, I think we've been celebrating the centenary of the first woman appointed to lead a congregation. So that would be 100 years. My hunch is, of course, that when you move into the more, state Presbyterians didn't do this very quickly. Congregationists did it a little bit earlier. My hunch is, but I'm not really very good on this, and someone will put me right, is that if you move into the more radical sects, if you like, so maybe talking about Quakers or other Anabaptist groups, that in some places women were leading worship much earlier than that. Anyone know the history of the Society of Friends? And the place of women within that? Okay, that would be worth looking at. But within the things I'm talking about, it's a 20th century, earlier than the Church of England, and far earlier, presumably, than our friends in the Roman Catholic Church, if that ever happens. But
well, there seems to be a barrier theologically in the non-established church for women preaching or taking theologically.
You've got obviously the text where Paul talks about women in church. There's only a couple of them, and so you got that really difficult one in 1 Corinthians chapter 14. An interesting text, and we should have a talk about that another time, because what's it doing in that argument? It's not quite clear. But then the people were debating on that ground, but also, of course, because that was the wider society, and the church is always sadly shaped by the assumptions of the wider society. Happened 200 years ago, it happens today. That we battle with that, don't we? How can we follow Jesus and not be nudged off the path by the assumptions of our culture? That's a problem in many areas. So does that answer the question?
To add to what was just said, I just read last week that in AD 135, two ladies taught by one of the early schools taught wonderfully, and they were killed for their faith, AD 135. A little earlier at Thyatira, a woman was the church was rebuked by Jesus for allowing her to mislead her servants into sin. Jesus didn't object to her gender, only to her false teaching.
Thank you. Perhaps I can say, while you're thinking of more questions, the 3 of the talks are available on YouTube. I was going to put up really helpful links there, but it's come out in faint type, the bit that you really need to read. So I apologize for that. 2 of the talks are available through the video page on this church's website, which is beaconsfield-urc.org. The other talk is available at that rather long address, but actually if you just do a search for Luther 500 Beaconsfield, for that last week's talk, the name Towie, Dr. Anthony Towie, the speaker, that will call up the video probably, or at least you will find it somewhere in that search.
I'll link it onto our video page on the website.
And Paul will link it onto our video page as well. And this talk also, should you be willing to hear it yet again, will also be available via the church's website.
Francis, yes.
Nigel, just quickly, in your stream of history, when did Presbyterianism first register as a title?
Right. Thank you. That's a very interesting question, Francis. You get, the quick answer is I don't know. All those names start appearing at the beginning, Baptist, what we call Presbyterian, I'm stalling for time here, is not called Presbyterian on the continent. Churches that follow Calvin on the continent are called Reformed churches. Yeah, it's an English thing to call them Presbyterian. Scottish too. Did John Knox call himself Presbyterian? I don't know, though clearly he's formative for that Scottish tradition.
One of the Scots here is nodding his head. So.
Right. Oh, okay. The short answer, how about 16th century? Probably. And I need to go away and check on that.
3 centuries more accurate than I had in mind.
Is somebody want to ask a question? Yes.
I have a vague memory from school time. I think it was the time of the Commonwealth. People were saying in complaint, new presbyteries but old priests writ large.
That John Milton said that, yes, new presbyteries but old priests writ large. Milton's really interesting because John Milton, who was a brilliant lad, and he was had an official position under Cromwell. He started off as a Presbyterian, if you like, well, as a mature person. He was an enthusiastic Presbyterian. And then when he saw what the Presbyterians were doing, because Milton loved liberty, yeah, and he thought the Presbyterians are going to infringe my liberty in just the way that the old priests did in the past. So Milton then became a Congregationalist because he thought there would be more liberty as a Congregationalist. Interestingly enough, Thomas Hobbes writes exactly the same thing, and he sees stages of the untying of knots of religion. And the last one is when you become a Congregationalist, and there is freedom, which Thomas Hobbes wanted for his purposes, and John Milton wanted for his purposes. So, yeah, and, some people went even further. So we talked about Isaac Pennington, who's good Puritan, and his son's a Quaker. And you got that movement through nonconformity, from Presbyterian to, maybe independent Congregationalist, or maybe off into the Society of Friends, or maybe off into, the Baptist churches and so on. It's a gradient, and people travel along that path, or families do through the generations. But lovely quotation to remember.
Well, we have time for just one more question. Does anybody want to put that? Yes.
Could you tell me what the baptism was that these nonconformists had? What did they go in for? Did they go in for christening, or were they baptized at infant time?
Yeah, no, that's good, isn't it? Certainly the people we're talking about, certainly they baptized children. They wouldn't have called it christening, but they baptized babies. Yep, that's, they were. So Calvin believes that children should be baptized. The children of believers, babies should be baptized. Yeah. Obviously, it's the Baptist tradition says no, wait till they're adults. But Calvin and the Presbyterians certainly, and probably the Congregationalists, not quite sure, they all said, yes, we gladly baptize children. And they would certainly, you pretty much have to baptize a child by sprinkling. No one's going to immerse a baby. So it was just thinking of it practically. It would have been the baptism of babies sprinkled, and there are records for the baptisms of children in the 18th century dissenters here in Beaconsfield. I have to wrap my brains a bit because I haven't been thinking about that quite so recently. But there are records of that. But they certainly baptized. Don't confuse them with extreme groups that didn't baptize or didn't celebrate the sacraments, the Lord's Supper.
Did they have to come to a point of faith to be baptized? They didn't have to...
No, so what I'm saying, if you baptize a baby,
yes,
you entrust that baby to the grace of God. That the parents should be believing parents is probably the only condition. But the Presbyterians, certainly then and now, and we do too, we're glad to baptize babies on the parents' profession of faith. So that's quite an important one.
Well, we're drawing up to 12 o'clock, which is the time when we said we'd complete. Just like to ask Alan to come forward and propose the vote of thanks.
It was 4 weeks ago that we started our first talk, and the introduction was three medieval churchmen sitting on a park bench in Geneva. And we've travelled a long way since.
In Paris.
In one town or another. And over that time, we've heard fascinating talks, and This morning's talk, I think, has been particularly illuminating, and I don't think anybody will leave here and say, I haven't learnt anything. And I don't think anybody will leave here and say, my understanding has not been increased. And I hope that everybody will remember the final paragraph, if that's the right way of putting it, of Nigel's address. Because that's where we are now. It is churches together for the glory of God. And thank you very, very much, Nigel, for this morning's talk.
Thank you.